Hello and welcome to The Public Good. This is Sam Magavern from the Partnership for the Public Good, or PPG, which unites over 270 community organizations working to build a better Buffalo. Delighted to be joining you every Tuesday at 7 p.m. here on Power 96.5 FM and Mix 1080 AM. Today we'll be joined by Nicole Hallet. She's a professor of law at the University of Buffalo Law School. She'll be talking about her new report, Workers on the Brink, Low-Wage Employment in Buffalo and Erie County. Don't forget to follow PPG on Facebook and Twitter, and of course you can always get great information on our website, ppgbuffalo.org. The Public Good is sponsored in part by Univera Healthcare, real people who really care. You can find videos from this show on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ppgbuffalo, and you can find video from previous week's shows on our YouTube channel. A few quick announcements for you before we get started. The Coalition for Economic Justice and other local organizations are organizing a bus to Albany on June 4th. It's part of the Poor People's Campaign. It'll be leaving from the LaSalle NFTA Park and Ride location at 5:30 a.m. on June 4th. Return to Buffalo around 10 p.m. that night. The groups will be heading down to Albany and joining action in more than 30 states around the nation demanding a right to health and healthy planet. You can find out more at the Facebook event page, Poor People's Campaign Bus to Albany, Healthcare and Environment. On June 3rd, Queers for Racial Justice will be having a parade dedicated to Kidda Tanya Harvey, as well as to honor the lives of queer and trans people and people of color. Parade lineup will begin at 10 a.m. in lots R13 and R14 at Buff State. Parade participants must arrive no later than 11 a.m. Parade starts promptly at noon. To learn more, please visit the Facebook event page called Pride and Resistance, a Queer Liberation Extravaganza. And lastly, I want to let you know that Heron Simmons Price of Voice Buffalo will be hosting a reading group tomorrow at Voice's offices at the Tri-Main building. 6 p.m. They will be discussing excerpts from Cornell West's collection entitled The Radical King, about the radical side of Martin Luther King. Everyone is welcome to join. That's tomorrow, Wednesday, 6 p.m. at Voice Buffalo in the Tri-Main Center, reading group about Cornell West's The Radical King. All right, with that, I want to welcome Nicole Hallet to the show to talk about Workers on the Brink. Thanks for being here, Nicole.
Thank you, Sam.
So this was a major report that you released this year documenting some of the conditions that low-wage workers face in Buffalo and Erie County. Tell us a little bit about how you went about doing the research for this report.
So the report basically reports out on a survey that I did in the summer of 2017. And I surveyed several hundred low-wage workers in the city of Buffalo in order to try to get a sense for some of the problems that they were facing. And so the specific areas that I was focused on was pay and wage issues, health and safety issues, and the various benefits that they do or do not get from their employment. These were areas that I identified as a workers' rights attorney for the last decade. I anecdotally had heard stories of issues that low-wage workers had in the area. And what I really wanted to do is I wanted to document with empirical data exactly what was happening with low-wage workers in the region.
And you came up with some pretty dramatic results in terms of the workers' responses, particularly when it came to legal violations that seem very, very common here in Buffalo and Erie County. What were some of the key findings that you came up with?
Yes, so first, I just to make clear, I did not actually ask the survey participants directly, are you the victim of a legal violation? And the reason that I didn't do that is because many workers don't realize that they've been the victims of a legal violation. And so what I did instead was I tried to gather information about their pay, their working conditions, their hours, so that I could make a determination as an expert as to whether a legal violation had occurred. And when I give you the numbers, you're right, the legal violations were widespread, but I think that actually those numbers undercount how prevalent the violations are. And the reason is because when there was any ambiguity in the data, I always assumed that there wasn't a legal violation. So I only counted when it was very, very clear. And the reason that I did it is because I didn't want to overcount legal violations, but I think the result is that these numbers are actually a little bit low in terms of what you might see if you were able to do a more extensive survey. So just to give you some of the numbers, which I think are really telling. So the first is that 16% of low-wage workers represented on the survey that they were making below the relevant minimum wage.
Now that's shocking right there. So a large number of workers, 16%, when you did the math, it seemed that they're making less than a minimum wage. How does that come about? How does it come about that someone makes less than a minimum wage when that's been the law of the land for so long?
So, of course, every worker's situation is unique, but I did notice some patterns in terms of how they were getting paid under the minimum wage. So one thing that was very common is that New York State has raised its minimum wage over the last few years. At the time of the study, it was $9.70. It's since gone up higher than that. But in many cases, I could tell that their employers had not updated the wage based on recent wage hikes. So I could see that, for instance, their wage might have been compliant with the law a few years ago, but was no longer compliant. So that was one thing that I saw. Another very common way that this happens is that there are certain workers who are allowed to be salaried. So I'm sure you're on salary. I'm on salary. We're both professionals. That's allowed, right? And the reason is because we're making enough money that it's assumed that we don't have to be paid for every extra hour of work. And so we get our work done. We work on salary. When you're a low-wage worker, that's not actually allowed. And the idea is that if you put someone on salary when they're making a very little amount, it can often bring their wages below the minimum wage. The law doesn't allow that. So what I saw was many workers who were salaried, maybe making, $250 a week, $300 a week, and then working a lot of hours, right? And so this is one way that an employer can make it seem like maybe this is legit. Workers don't know that they're not allowed to be salaried, but in fact, it doesn't comply with the law.
Are there certain occupations or businesses where that's more common to put workers on salary who should be getting an hourly wage?
Yes, so I would say one of the most common scenarios are people in the restaurant industry, and particularly people who are working in the back of the house. On the survey, I asked people which industry they worked in and also what their job title was. So I can't tell exactly what people are doing from that, but I did see a lot of dishwashers, cooks, food runners, people like that who are not the sort of high-paid servers in the restaurant, but are doing some sort of work in the restaurant industry. I actually also saw it in the retail sector, and I assume I didn't ask for the names of the employers because I didn't want people to feel frightened that their employer would find out that they were participating in the survey. So I don't know what retailers, which kinds of retailers might be doing this. But in my personal experience, what I found is oftentimes mom and pop shops where you might have only 3 or 4 employees. Oftentimes, in order to cut labor costs, those employers put people on salary at a fairly low salary. They're not doing this at Walmart, for instance. They're doing this at kind of smaller employers. So that's basically what I saw.
So 16% of their respondents said that they were making less than the minimum wage once you calculated it. What was some of the other most common violations that you uncovered?
Well, so in terms of overtime, so overtime is the idea that if you work more than 40 hours per week, that you have to be paid time and a half of your hourly rate. Again, you and I aren't entitled to overtime because we are, high-paid professionals. Low-wage workers almost uniformly are entitled to overtime, and 35% reported that they were not being paid overtime. So again, that can be for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it's because they're salaried, so they're working more than 40 hours a week, but they're not getting compensated for it. Oftentimes what I heard is that they had a 40-hour schedule, and when they worked extra hours, their employer just instructed them not to record those hours. So they were both unpaid overtime hours, but they were also off-the-clock hours, which was another thing that I asked about. And in fact, 16% of workers in the study reported that they had been asked to work off the clock without pay. So there was some overlap between those two numbers.
So that one's pretty blatant. The employer is just saying work for free a certain
amount
of
and
time.
In fact that is a legal violation that people typically are aware of, that they're supposed to be paid. But it's actually sometimes unclear if you're on salary and maybe you're not making very much money, but you think maybe this is just the way it is. You hear of a teacher or a nurse that that's not getting overtime, and you think maybe they can do that to me too.
Yeah.
Labor and employment law is very complicated. Of course, business owners have an obligation to figure out what the law is, but workers often don't know what the law is, and they many low-wage workers don't have the freedom to leave a job when they feel like they are potentially being taken advantage of. So they might suspect that something is not kosher, but they might decide to stay in that job because they don't know what else is out there.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the other wage and hour violations. So we talked about not being paid a minimum wage, working off the clock, not getting full overtime. What else did you uncover with wage and hour violations?
Well, another very common thing that happened is basically not receiving a paycheck. So it's payday, you go pick up your paycheck, and it's not there. And we also asked, so that was 27% of workers said that had happened to them. So that's more than a quarter of workers at their current job. So I was only asking about their current job. Many of the workers I spoke to kind of informally when we were doing the survey mentioned that they had these issues in the past. I think if you asked workers, had they ever had this issue, the numbers would skyrocket again, because many low-wage workers have a series of jobs over their lifetime. But in terms of the reasons that people were given for why their paycheck wasn't there, sometimes they heard like, oh, it was a mistake, we forgot to submit to payroll, so it was sort of like a kind of like, oh, oops, sorry.
Yeah.
Of course, that may or may not be true. I have no idea whether those employers actually legitimately made a mistake or whether it was intentional. But for low-wage workers, not getting the paycheck on time is really, really, really bad. They're often living paycheck to paycheck. They often are waiting to pay bills such as rent and utilities and car payments and that sort of thing until they get their next paycheck. And so it can be very disruptive to not get a paycheck on time. Even if it's just a few days delayed, it might mean getting, being threatened with eviction. It might mean getting your penalties on your car payment or getting your car towed. So there are a lot of things that happen that come as a result of that. Some also reported that their employer said that they just didn't have the money to pay them. So when you're talking about very small businesses that are kind of operating very close to the the red-black line, that there might be weeks when there simply wasn't money in the bank accounts to pay. And then many workers reported that they hadn't been told what the problem was, that they were sort of in the dark about it. So again, these are things that they seem small, and for some people, maybe having a delayed paycheck for a few days wouldn't be a big deal. But for the workers in this study who are living this close to the poverty line already, it can have a huge effect.
How about tipped workers? What did you uncover about their wage and hour situation?
Well, yes, we did ask. We asked whether the workers received tips, and then we did that for a couple of reasons. We wanted to ask what happened to the tips that they received. We also wanted to ask because right now in New York, if you receive tips, your employer may be able to pay you less than the full minimum wage. So right now, if you are a tipped worker in New York, you only have to make $7.50 an hour. Actually, under federal law, it's $2.13 an hour, which is very, very low. So we wanted to know whether they made tips so that we could calculate whether their employer was complying with the minimum wage. But moreover, we wanted to ask what happened to the tips. And what we found is that 24% of tipped workers in the study reported that their employer had taken some or all of their tips. So almost a quarter of tipped workers were actually not able to keep all of their tips. And one reason that this is very important is that the state of New York right now is considering whether to eliminate that lower minimum wage and perhaps to make tipped employers pay the full minimum wage just like all other workers. And I think one good reason to support that policy is because although in theory these workers are making tips, in practice, at least a good portion of them are not able to benefit from those tips. And because we want to make sure that nobody is basically left with almost nothing at the end of the week, so a very low weekly wage and no tips, we want to make sure that they have the stability of the higher minimum wage.
So let's pause on that issue for a moment, since it is a very live one here in New York, where there is the proposal to raise the minimum wage for tipped workers to the regular minimum wage. And I know you testified in favor of that. And there's, of course, significant opposition from the employers and also from some of the higher tipped employees I know come out because they're worried that they'll end up losing from it. What's the experience been in states that have done this, that have gone ahead and just had one minimum wage for everyone and not had the lower minimum wage for tip workers? Have the workers come out ahead? Has it hurt the businesses? What's the experience been in other states?
Right, so there have been 8 states that either never had a tipped minimum wage or have abolished the tipped minimum wage in recent years, including states as diverse as California and Alaska and Montana. So we're talking about a wide variety of states. We're not talking about all just kind of liberal coastal states. We're not talking about small states or big states. Kind of, it runs the gamut. And what the research shows is that this sort of doomsday scenario that's envisioned by the restaurant industry does not come to pass. So I don't know if you've been to California recently, but you are able to go out to restaurants in California. The restaurant industry hasn't collapsed. When you look at the data, the restaurant industry has grown in those states at rates similar to the rest of the country, or even higher in some places, and the wages of tipped workers has gone up. So one of the, and you are totally right, this issue does not split like in the normal way where workers on one side, employers on the other. Workers are split about this proposal as well. And I think workers are afraid that somehow it's going to disrupt the tip system, and they I think their employers, the restaurants, have tried to fan that fear by saying we're going to have to close, we're going to have to cut staff. So I think it's really important to look at what's actually happened rather than kind of what people say. But I also think that if you just think about it as a consumer who goes to restaurants. So let's say that my bill would normally be $25, but because they've had to price in a slight increase in the labor costs, so the food is slightly more expensive. So let's say now I have to pay $28, all right? Now, in your personal experience, would you pay more tips or less tips on a $28 tip? A $28 bill versus a $25 bill.
Right, you pay more.
You pay more because
bill.
You pay a percentage. Right. I know very few people who, when the bill goes up a few dollars, pay less in tips. Right. So the whole thought that because food prices would go up, consumers would tip less, it doesn't actually make sense to anyone who's ever visited a restaurant, right? Now, of course, there may be a few people who are cheap. There always are people who are cheap, but they're probably going to be cheap anyway, right? And when you look at how much the food prices have to go up in order to account for the extra, labor costs, it's not that much. It's a few pennies on the dollar. It really isn't substantial. And what you're getting in return is you are getting a workforce that is not living hand to mouth close to the poverty line, that knows from week to week that there's going to be a certain amount of money they can depend on, with tips kind of equaling extra if they get them, but that they aren't dependent on the tips. And we've seen all sorts of reasons why that might be good policy. So if you look in the sexual harassment realm, many female servers feel like they have to put up with sexual harassment by the customers because if they don't, they're not going to get tipped. No one should have to put up with sexual harassment in order to put food on the table. So this would give female service, for example, a little bit more leeway to say, you know what, I'm not going to put up with this customer's behavior because I know that I'm still going to be able to put food on the table at the end of the day, right? And when you've looked at restaurants, so the other thing that I think restaurant owners say is that they're going to eliminate tips. They're going to say don't tip. There have been a few restaurants that have tried this. Most of them have ended up abandoning it because people end up tipping anyway. Because tipping is deeply ingrained in our culture. So I think the idea that tipping is going to disappear entirely, maybe it happens eventually. I can't tell where the culture is going to go in 100 years, but the thought that tomorrow wages are going to go up and so everyone will stop tipping, it just doesn't ring true.
Well, especially when 8 states have this law, and in none of those states.
Sure, I've been to California since then. I've tipped. I've never thought, the workers are making a few more dollars than they used to, so I'm going to not pay a tip. It just doesn't. Right. So, and really, when you look at it, like the workers that tend to be against the proposal tend to be workers who are in high-end restaurants where they're making a lot of tips. They tend to be white. They're more often white. They tend to be higher paid, and so they have a lot to fear from the system changing because the system's working well for them right now. And I think that is, if you're acting in self-interest, that's a totally legitimate reason to not be in support of this proposal. But the idea about public policy is you're not supposed to make decisions based on what's good for an individual. You're supposed to look at the collective good, right? Yeah. This radio show is called The Public Good, right? Yeah. We're concerned about the public good. And when you look at workers at the bottom end of the distribution system, those are the workers that are most likely to get their tips stolen. They're the most likely to be exploited by their employers. They make much less in tips when you're talking about kind of fast casual restaurants or lower end restaurants. And those are the workers that I think will really benefit from this proposal. My personal opinion is that those high end workers will probably not benefit that much, but probably won't
lose,
right? Yeah. And really you're going to see it bringing people up from the bottom end of the income distribution. And in that way, I think that it's good policy, even if there are some workers in certain establishments that feel like the current system is working just fine for them. So when I see the signs that say, it's not broken, don't fix it, it's not broken for that person or that restaurant, right? Yeah. So you have to kind of think about this. You can't have a policy that only applies to certain people, right? Like it has to be a universal policy.
Yeah, and when you look at tipped workers overall, their annual income as a total group is very, very low.
Very low, and something like 45% of tipped workers nationwide rely on public benefits. That's really high. That should make us think that, there's this sense that, they're just greedy, they want more money, everyone else, all these other minimum wage workers are only making the minimum wage, and tipped workers are like already making so much more money. Yeah. And when you look at the data, it's just not there. Yeah. Because it's very uneven. It's insecure. You can't count on it from night to night. Right. And so it does lead to a situation in which it leads to insecurity, economic insecurity. And we, as taxpayers, are all paying that cost, right? So, I don't personally think that restaurants should get a special deal. Why should everyone else have to pay the minimum wage and they shouldn't? They've successily lobbied up until this point to convince decision makers that it would be, doomsday catastrophic if they were to have to pay minimum wage, but it just hasn't borne out in the states that have tried it. So I understand why some workers are afraid, and I am it's unfortunate that I think that people are giving them those ideas and making them feel like this is going to lead to more insecurity and lower wages. But I do think that we should be looking at the data and not making decisions based on fears or on fear-mongering, which is how I interpret this, but really on what has happened. And the great thing about our federalist system is that there have been experiments elsewhere, and everything has been fine. Yeah. The sky hasn't fallen. People still go out to eat. Right. Tipping still exists. Yeah, and
poverty is lower. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a great sidebar on the question of tipped workers. Let's go back to your report now and talk about the health and safety violations that you uncovered. So what did workers tell you about health and safety on the job here in Buffalo and Erie County?
Right. So health and safety, it's a little bit hard to do a survey because there are so many different variables. And so instead of trying to figure out whether a legal violation had occurred, because there are legal obligations of employers for safe and workplaces. But what I wanted to get a sense from the survey was workers' own impressions of whether their workplace was safe and whether they felt like their employer had adequately prepared them for that environment. So we first asked whether a worker either handled dangerous materials or dangerous equipment. The idea was that if someone is in a job where there aren't that many health and safety concerns, if they haven't gotten adequate training, it's probably not as big of a deal as if they are in an environment where there are true safety concerns. So we took that subset of workers, and then we asked them whether they felt like they had been properly trained, and whether they felt like they had proper safety and protective gear, just to get a sense for what kinds of problems they were facing. Again, like with the wage violations, a substantial minority of workers reported that there were health and safety concerns in their workplace. So a third of low-wage workers reported that they didn't have adequate safety or protective gear. So that's quite a few when you think about the whole. And 26.7% reported that they hadn't been adequately trained. So we have a good minority of low-wage workers who feel insecure in their workplaces. And interestingly, 16% of the workers surveyed had actually been injured on the job. So this was not necessarily a theoretical, for some workers it was, that they were worried that something was going to happen, but that it hadn't happened yet. But it was not uncommon that people had actually been injured on the job. And so we could see that these, the lack of appropriate training and safety and protective gear had real-world effects in terms of these workers' ability to stay safe in their workplaces.
So if we were going to summarize your report, I think we would say that low-wage workers in Buffalo and Erie County are getting exploited at really an alarming rate, both when it comes to their wages and when it comes to health and safety, working in dangerous conditions. What are some of the most important things we can do to address that situation?
Well, I think we often think about wage and hour violations and health and safety violations as being something that the federal government is concerned about and something that the state government has some jurisdiction over. But one thing that I really called for in the report was for our local governments, both Erie County and the City of Buffalo, to take a more active role in ensuring that low-wage workers are not exploited. And, to me, it requires a little bit of a reorientation from our public officials' current orientation towards these issues. So there's so much focus on getting jobs here, as, of course, there should be, because we need good jobs and we need to make sure that people who need them can get to them and all of those issues. But I think what my study really points out is just having a job is not enough. We need to make sure that the job is something that keeps someone out of poverty and that isn't dangerous. These are sort of like basic minimal levels that we should expect. And so I proposed a series of policies that the local governments, either Erie County or City of Buffalo or both, could adopt in order to try to protect low-wage workers and workers in general. Now, of course, I focused on low-wage workers because I think the issues are the most prevalent there. But these sorts of issues happen to workers of all income levels, and so policies can target all workers, but maybe focus on low-wage employment because that's where most of the problems are.
So top three, we're short on time, but let's make sure we get kind of your most important recommendations.
Well, so in terms of combating wage theft, there have been many localities all around the country that have taken steps to try to encourage employers to follow the law. And one that I think that is the most interesting is making the provision of business licenses dependent on complying with the law. So there are many repeat players. They constantly violate the law, and the idea is that those companies should not be able to operate. They certainly shouldn't be able to take advantage of city contracts. So that's another idea, is to limit city contracts to employers that have proven that they've been able to comply with the law and pay their workers. Now, we do have a living wage law in the City of Buffalo. We do not have one in Erie County. That's something that I think it would be a good step. And the idea is that at the very least, we should be encouraging employers to pay a living wage. And, of course, my study focused on below the minimum wage, but I think one way to raise wages across the board is to ensure that at least if you have a government contract, you're paying the living wage. Another proposal that I think is very important, and this goes to sort of the health and safety aspect of the study, is that we should have paid sick leave in employers should be required to provide paid sick leave. That would help both in terms of making sure that whatever health and safety issues in the workplace are not adversely affecting someone's employment, but also from the perspective of public health, we should be encouraging people to stay home from work when they are sick, when their kids are sick, so that has a whole bunch of positive effects that I think would be helpful both for what was pointed out in my study and just otherwise.
And again, something that other cities and counties have done.
Other cities and counties have done this, including New York City, and where it's been very successful. And although, yes, I'm sure small businesses will object because it's an additional burden, there are ways of constructing a policy that minimizes that burden, and the positive effects, I think, would far outweigh any burden that would be put on local employers and the local economy. There are other things that can be done, but I think those are probably three of the most important.
Fantastic. And we'll urge folks to go online, ppgbuffalo.org, and get the full report, Workers on the Brink, Low-Wage Employment in Buffalo and Erie County. We are running out of time, so I want to thank Professor Nicole Hallet from the UB Law School for being on the show and for this great report, Workers on the Brink. Next week on The Public Good, we'll be talking with Corey Green. He is the film director who did the project, The Blackness Project, a documentary about culture and race from the perspective of African Americans and other minorities. It's The Public Good every Tuesday at 7 p.m. on Power 96.5 FM and Mix 1080 AM. Thank you.